The night Harriet Bloom walked into the dining room of Aubergine, one of the most talked-about restaurants in downtown Vancouver, she wasn't thinking about fate. She was thinking about the grease stain on her left sleeve and whether head server Marcus would notice before the dinner rush hit. She ducked into the staff room, dabbed at the stain with a damp cloth, and decided it was good enough. 27 years old, 8 months into this job, and she'd learned that good enough was usually what kept you employed at a place like Aubergine, where the prix fixe started at $200, and the sommelier had once written an opinion piece for the Globe and Mail about the tragedy of ice in wine glasses. It was a Wednesday. Wednesdays were slow, which meant the floor manager, a precise man named Roland, would have too much time to walk around looking for problems. Harriet tied her apron strings behind her back and went out to check her section. Table 11 was already occupied. A man sat there alone, positioned slightly away from the table in the way people in wheelchairs sometimes need to be, his jacket dark and well cut, his hands folded in his lap. He wasn't looking at the menu, he was looking at the door. Harriet recognized that look. It was the look of someone waiting for a person they weren't entirely sure would show up. She gave him a moment before approaching. "Good evening. Can I start you with some still or sparkling water while you wait?" He looked up. He had a calm face, the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a conventional sense but had settled into something more interesting with age, mid-40s maybe, with lines around his eyes that suggested he either laughed a lot or squinted in the sun. "Still, water please, and I think she should be here any moment." "Of course, I'll give you some time." She brought the water, set it carefully, and moved to her other tables. From across the room she watched the door open 4 times in the next 15 minutes. None of them were his person. The 5th time the door opened, it was a woman in a cream blazer, and Harriet could tell immediately. She had the walk of someone who had been watched her whole life and had learned to use it. Tall, polished, the kind of blonde that required monthly maintenance. She scanned the room, found the man at table 11, and something crossed her face so quickly that Harriet almost missed it. Disappointment, pure and undisguised, and then it replaced by professional smile of a woman who had been in difficult situations before and knew how to manage them. Harriet went to greet her at the host's stand, but the woman had already moved past, making her way across the room. Harriet followed at a small distance, water pitcher in hand. "You must be Conrad," the woman said, stopping beside table 11. She did not sit. "I'm Stephanie, it's good to meet you," he said, and started to gesture toward the chair across from him. Stephanie glanced down at the wheelchair, back up at his face, back down. Then she picked up her clutch from where she'd rested it against the table and held it against her chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," she said, not unkindly, but not kindly either, in the way you'd apologize for a scheduling conflict. "I should have asked more questions beforehand. I don't think this is going to work for me." The dining room wasn't loud to begin with. It got quieter. "I see," Conrad said. "I'm sure you understand." She was already turning. "I hope you enjoy your evening." And she walked out the same way she'd walked in, except now her heels on the hardwood sounded different. Sharper, more final. Harriet stood very still with the water pitcher in her hand. She was aware that 3 other tables were watching. She was aware that Roland was somewhere behind her, probably noting the situation with his clipboard. She was aware that the correct professional response was to approach table 11 with quiet efficiency, offer a fresh water pour, and allow the man his dignity without drawing further attention. She did approach table 11, but she set the water pitcher down on the nearest surface and she sat, briefly, just for a moment, in the empty chair across from Conrad. Roland would probably fire her. She set that thought aside. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry you had to sit through that." Conrad looked at her. His expression hadn't crumbled, it hadn't gone blank the way she might have expected. If anything, he looked faintly tired, in the way of a man who had encountered this particular shape of the world before and had simply not yet found a way to be fully unsurprised by it. "It happens," he said. "It shouldn't." He held her gaze for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "No," he agreed. "It shouldn't." Harriet stood up, retrieved the water pitcher, and poured his glass to the top. "If you'd like to stay for dinner, the duck breast tonight is extraordinary. Chef gets it from a farm in the Fraser Valley. I'll make sure you have the best table in the room." He stayed. He ordered the duck breast and a glass of a burgundy that cost more than Harriet's grocery budget for the month. He ate slowly, without looking at his phone, and when Harriet swung past to check on him, he was reading a small paperback he'd produced from somewhere inside his jacket. She didn't interrupt. At the end of the meal, when she brought the bill, he tucked a card into the leather folder along with it. Not a business card. Just a plain card with neat handwriting. Thank you for that. Conrad Aiken. She kept the card without knowing why. Harriet Bloom had been a server for 6 years, across 3 different restaurants, which meant she had developed an extremely accurate internal radar for which managers were decent human beings and which ones would eventually make her life difficult. At Aubergine, that person was not Roland, who was meticulous but fair. It was the assistant general manager, a man named Jeffrey, who had the specific energy of someone who had wanted to be important in a more visible industry and had settled for this one. Jeffrey had started making comments about 3 months after Harriet joined the team. Small things. Whether she was paying enough attention to the high-value tables, whether she smiled enough, whether she'd thought about adjusting her communication style with certain guests. The comments were never quite specific enough to call out directly, which she suspected was intentional. She ignored them. She was good at her job. Her tip averages were among the highest on the floor. She told herself that would be enough. It wasn't enough. The night Jeffrey cornered her in the wine cellar while she was doing inventory was a Thursday in late November. He stood too close and spoke too quietly, and what he said was framed as a kind of opportunity, a recommendation to the events team, which paid better, which would be very good for her career. Contingent on things. Harriet had no interest in being contingent on anything. She told him no, clearly, without ambiguity. She was let go 4 days later. Roland delivered the news with his eyes somewhere near the floor, and when she asked for a reason, he gave her the phrase restructuring of service staff, which she recognized as a thing people said when they couldn't say the real thing. She packed her locker and walked out into a December rain and stood under the awning on Robson Street for a few minutes while the cold settled into her coat. Then she went home and recalculated her rent. The weeks that followed were not elegant. Harriet had savings, but Vancouver rent did not respect savings. She picked up shifts at a neighborhood café called Birchwood, where the pay was lower, and the hours were less predictable, and where she made a ritual of telling herself that this was temporary while privately not being certain that it was. She didn't tell her mother. Her mother lived in Kelowna and had opinions about Harriet's choices that tended to arrive pre-packaged with the suggestion that Harriet should have chosen differently. The energy required to field that conversation was not available to her right now. She was working the Sunday morning shift at Birchwood, the one that started at 6:30, which meant she'd been on her feet since before sunrise, when the door opened at 9 and a familiar face came in. Conrad Aiken did not immediately recognize her. She watched the moment he did, a small pause in his forward motion, a recalibration. "You work here now," he said. Not unkindly, observationally. "I do." She held up the coffee pot. "The usual, or something new today?" He didn't know her usual at Aubergine, of course, so the question landed oddly, and he smiled at that. A real smile this time, not the adjacent to one she'd seen before. "Whatever you'd recommend." She brought him a pour-over that the cafe's head barista had been particularly proud of that morning, and a slice of the brown butter banana bread that she'd been quietly steering regulars toward for 2 weeks. He accepted both, and when the breakfast rush slowed, asked if she had a moment. "I don't want to overstep," he said, when she'd settled onto a stool at the far end of the counter. "But you were at Aubergine and now you're here, and I know that's not my business." "It's not," she agreed pleasantly. "But if there's something that happened there that I should know about as someone who recommends that restaurant-to-business contacts, I'd want to know." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Jeffrey and his specific kind of quiet. She thought about Roland's averted eyes. "There was a situation," she said carefully, "with a manager, and when I made clear that his situation wasn't welcome, I was let go." Conrad didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry that happened. Me too. Have you thought about whether there's anything to be done about it?" She had thought about it extensively, actually. She'd looked into it. She'd spoken to a friend who knew an employment lawyer. It was complicated and slow and expensive, and the likely outcome was a settlement that wouldn't close to making her whole, and the less likely outcome was nothing at all. "I've thought about it," she said. "It's a lot." He nodded and didn't push. He ate the banana bread. Before he left, he put his card on the counter, a proper business card this time, cream stock embossed lettering. Conrad Aiken, Aiken Group. She recognized the name. She'd heard it in passing at Aubergine, the way you heard names of significant people. Attached to significant tables, significant purchases. The Aiken Group was, among other things, a hospitality investment firm that held stakes in 14 restaurants across British Columbia, including Aubergine. She sat with that information for a while after he'd gone. Conrad Aiken came into Birchwood every Sunday after that. Sometimes other days, too. He was a good customer in the specific way that people who have had a lot of money for a long time tend to be. Not flashy about it, not condescending, tipping in a way that was generous without being performative. He and Harriet talked. First about small things. The neighborhood, the coffee, a construction project outside that had been going on for what seemed like an unreasonable number of weeks. Then larger things. He'd started his company at 32 after a cycling accident at 30, left him with a spinal injury that had taken 2 years and multiple surgeries to stabilize. He talked about that, matter-of-factly, the way you talk about a thing you've processed. She talked about her family in Kelowna and her complicated feelings about the hospitality industry and the novel she'd been starting and stopping for 3 years. "What's it about?" he asked one morning. "A woman who keeps making the right decisions and having them come out sideways," he laughed. Properly this time. Autobiographical? Somewhat. His mother called once while they were talking. She heard the phone buzzing, watched him glance at it, and set it face down. "You don't have to," she started. "She'll call again," he said simply. "She always calls again." She gathered that his mother, a woman named Dorothea who lived in West Vancouver in the family home, had not entirely made peace with the direction of Conrad's life since his accident. Not his career, which by any metric was extraordinarily successful. The direction more specifically pertaining to whether the right woman had come along yet, whether he was being realistic about what that might look like, whether he was taking care of himself properly. "She means well," he said, in the particular tone people use when they want credit for believing something they find difficult. "Most people do," Harriet said. The thing between them was not dramatic in its origins. It built the way most real things build. Slowly, through accumulated small moments, through the way two people start to orient toward each other without quite deciding to. He asked her to dinner in March, properly asked, not the Café, not coffee. A restaurant she'd never been to, a newer place on Main Street with a chef who'd trained in Lyon. He was nervous in a way that she found unexpectedly touching. She said yes, the dinner was good, the conversation was better. When he drove her home in a car that had been modified in ways she noticed but didn't comment on, she felt the specific warmth of someone who has spent several months in the company of a person they like and has finally arrived at the moment of admitting it. She met Dorothea Aiken 6 weeks later. Dorothea lived in a house in West Vancouver that managed to be both modest and expensive in the particular way of old family money. Not showy, but every surface was exactly right. She was 71 and small and had the posture of someone who had been told all her life to stand up straight and had decided to consider that good advice. She received Harriet politely. She offered tea. She asked questions in the careful way of someone conducting an assessment and attempting to conceal that they were conducting an assessment. "And you've been at Birchwood since January, but before that, aubergine." A small pause. "That's quite a change." "It is," Harriet agreed pleasantly. Dorothea looked at her son. Something passed between them, the kind of communication that happens between people who have known each other for decades and have learned to have entire conversations in a single glance. After Harriet excused herself to use the restroom, she heard. She wasn't trying to hear, but the house was old and the walls were the kind of plaster that carried sound, Dorothea say in a low and level voice. "She's a café server, Conrad," and Conrad's response equally level. "I know what she is." The drive back to the city was quiet for the first few minutes. Then Conrad said, "I'm sorry about that, don't be." Harriet looked out the window at the bridge lights on the water. "She loves you. She wants the right thing for you. She just isn't sure I'm it. She doesn't know you. She will." She said it with more certainty than she entirely felt, but she believed it was true. She had seen enough of the world to know that people were capable of change when they were given enough reason and enough time. The thing with Jeffrey came to resolution in April, not through the employment lawyer route, but through a different route entirely. It turned out that Harriet had not been Jeffrey's only situation. There were 2 other former aubergine employees, a hostess and a line cook, who had experienced variations of the same dynamic and the same outcome. One of them had, in fact, already spoken to an employment lawyer. When that lawyer reached out to Harriet through a mutual acquaintance, the case became considerably more substantial. The settlement happened quietly without going to tribunal, in a conference room in a building on Burrard Street. Jeffrey was no longer employed by the restaurant group by then. Roland, it turned out, had submitted his own internal complaint about Jeffrey's conduct 3 months earlier, through a process Harriet hadn't known was available to her. The outcome had taken time. That was how these things worked. Harriet was not wealthy at the end of it, but she was more whole than she had been. There was a specific satisfaction in being believed, in having the record reflect something closer to the truth. She sat in the elevator going down from the conference room and let herself feel it. She texted Conrad from the lobby. "It's done." His reply came back in under a minute. "Dinner tonight, wherever you want." She chose a Vietnamese place on Kingsway that she loved and could never justify on her café wages. It was not a $200 prix. The pho was remarkable. The weeks before Conrad's sister's wedding were tense in the specific way that events involving Dorothea Aiken tended to be tense. His sister, a landscape architect named Petra who lived in Victoria, had been warm and uncomplicated with Harriet from the first phone call. The kind of person who decided whether she liked you within the first 10 minutes and then never revisited the question. The warmth was a relief. Dorothea was coming around. Slowly. In the way that an iceberg came around. You couldn't see the movement happening, but the landscape was subtly different from one week to the next. She'd called Harriet twice. Once to ask a question about a restaurant she was considering for a lunch with friends. Once ostensibly to ask about Conrad's birthday. Though she'd stayed on the phone for 40 minutes talking about the house she'd grown up in Halifax, and a greenhouse her father had built in the backyard. Harriet suspected the birthday question was not the actual reason for the call. The wedding was in June, at a property outside Victoria that Petra and her partner had rented for the weekend. The ceremony was outdoors under old Douglas firs, with chairs set on grass that had been cut that morning and smelled like it. Harriet wore a green dress she'd found at a vintage shop on Commercial Drive and spent too long deciding whether it was appropriate before Conrad told her she looked beautiful and she decided to take him at his word. Dorothea arrived in a pale gray suit with a single strand of pearls, and she kissed her daughter and shook hands with the groom, and found her seat with the efficiency of a woman who had attended many events and knew how to navigate them. Harriet sat beside Conrad 2 rows back and felt the awareness of Dorothea's presence the way you feel weather changing. The ceremony was simple and genuine in the way of people who love each other and don't need to perform it. Petra cried at one point quietly, and her partner touched her cheek with 2 fingers and the audience collectively exhaled. Afterward, at the reception, Harriet was standing near the edge of the garden with a glass of wine when she felt a presence beside her, Dorothea. Small and upright and smelling faintly of something expensive. They stood for a moment without speaking, watching Petra make her way through the crowd of guests with her hand in her partner's. "She's happy," Harriet said. "She is." Dorothea's voice was quieter than usual. She was not always. She had some very difficult years. A pause. "Conrad as well. I know." "No," Dorothea said gently but precisely. "You know what he's chosen to tell you. There are things he hasn't told you yet. There are years that were not easy. For either of them. And I was not always. I was not the mother I should have been in some of those years. I was frightened and I made that into something less useful than fear should be." Harriet didn't say anything. She understood that this was not a moment for her to speak. "I watched you at that restaurant," Dorothea said. "What you did," he told me. "He tried not to make too much of it, but I know my son." She turned and looked at Harriet directly for the first time that evening. "He has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you, not in a long time." Harriet felt something tighten in her throat. She held the wineglass very carefully. Dorothea reached out and, with a deliberateness that was somehow more moving for its deliberateness, put her hand briefly over Harriet's. "I'm glad he found you," she said. "I wanted you to know that I mean that." Across the garden, Conrad was making his way toward them, in no hurry, navigating the uneven ground with the practiced ease of someone who long ago stopped apologizing for how he moved through the world. He caught Harriet's eye and raised an eyebrow, a question she answered with the smallest shake of her head that meant everything is fine, come over here. When he reached them, Dorothea patted his arm with the same deliberate warmth, and then excused herself to find her seat for dinner, and Conrad looked at Harriet. "What happened?" "Your mother told me she's glad you found me." He was quiet for a moment. She said that. He looked toward where Dorothea was making her way across the garden, and something in his face did what it had been trying not to do all day. "Okay," he said softly to no particular audience. "Okay." 2 months later, Harriet was offered a position managing front-of-house operations at a new hotel restaurant opening in Gastown. The offer came from someone who knew someone who had known Harriet at Aubergine, and the salary was more than she'd ever made in hospitality, and she said yes without calling her mother to ask for advice. She did tell Conrad, over coffee at a table in Birchwood, that she now occupied from the other side of the counter. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Don't," she said, but she was smiling. "I'm saying it anyway." She thought about the woman in the cream blazer walking out of a restaurant. She thought about Roland's eyes on the floor. She thought about the wine cellar and the rain outside on Robson Street, and the morning she'd stood under an awning and recalculated her rent. She thought about a card with neat handwriting and a pour-over coffee on a Sunday morning, and the way a man looked at her across a garden while his mother held her hand. The road from that Wednesday night to this morning had not been straight or short. It had come out sideways several times. But she was here, at a table in a café that smelled like good coffee and toasted bread, and the man across from her was looking at her the way she had learned, by now, to let herself be looked at. 3 weeks later, Conrad told her quietly and without drama, on a Tuesday evening while she was reading, and he was failing to concentrate on the papers in his lap, that he loved her. She looked up from her book. She told him she loved him too. They went back to what they'd been doing. Later that night, she called her mother.